All right, and we should be live on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Very
Yes,
cool.
we are.
Whoa.
We are. Excellent. How about that?
Nice.
How about that? So you should see it. You should see it on the feed. So, Ed Featherstone, Mark Thiele, how about just a quick round of intros and let's jump into the conversation. So, Ed, do you want to start us off first?
Sure. I'm Ed Featherstone, currently Director and Enterprise Architect at Thermo Fisher Scientific, working out of their cloud business office. My background is over 30 years in the consulting side of the world, and the last 10 years specifically focusing in the cloud space for a variety of companies. The last company I was working at as a consultant was Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and then I went in-house at Thermo Fisher.
Excellent. Mr. Thiele.
Hi, I'm Mark Thiele, CEO, co-founder of Edge. Longtime infrastructure weenie. Although my last job, technically, I was a CIO. My last job in IT, I was technically a CIO for a while. But I've been building infrastructure for companies like HP and Gilead and VMware and a few others for most of my career. And finally decided to start years ago, and that's how we ended up with it.
All right, so Mark, you're breaking up just a little bit there, but and I'm Tim Crawford. I'm CIO and strategic advisor with Avoa, and I thought we would just jump on and have a conversation about this. Ed and Mark and I were on Twitter a little while ago talking about this subject, and Mark, you started it. So you're responsible. You started the fight.
Always the troublemaker.
Always the troublemaker.
Sure.
And, I think that as I would sum it up, I'd say, are we as enterprises putting too many eggs in each cloud provider's basket? And, what does that mean? If you look at the big three providers, I mean, that's pretty much the majority of cloud infrastructure as a service usage, and secondarily software as a service usage. So is there a risk that we should be thinking about as enterprises, as end users?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I brought it up, Tim and Ed, and I appreciate you guys' interest in continuing the conversation, is that most of us think about the risk from one particular angle. Like, how does it affect my business's ability, as an example, my business's ability to continue to operate, right? The problem, though, is that the financial community notwithstanding, we're getting to the point now where we literally can't get into our homes, drive our cars, get our kids to school if we don't have access to certain technology capabilities. And so when I posited the question earlier today, I posited it really trying to get us to think about, okay, yes, the three largest cloud providers own a big chunk of everything. No, to your point, to Ed's point, that doesn't mean it's that different from some of the lock-in we've had with other with a limited number of providers in days gone by. But I do believe that there's a difference in the sense that, like an example you were just making, if one of those three cloud providers is down, what we find is, okay, our finance applications are unavailable. Well, let's go focus on doing this. Oh, crap, the supplier that supports us with that is also on Amazon and they're down. Or the company that supplies the pictures that the supplier needs in order to support us is down because they're on Amazon. Hence, it doesn't make any difference. If we're technically 95% up, we can't actually operate.
But let me maybe unpack a little bit of that, because if we look at the last few Amazon outages, it wasn't the entire Amazon service that was down. True. And most of the outages were relegated specifically to an availability zone, right? US East 1. So what is it specifically that we should be concerned about and thinking about as we go through this? Because is this really a concern of there's too much riding on any one particular cloud provider, or is the issue that it's, as I posed in Twitter, that it's more of an architectural question? And Ed, I know you had some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, and I think it's a mixture of all of the above and other pieces as well. I mean, like you say, the big well-known AWS outages were all one availability zone, US East 1, which is the default one that almost everybody in the world drops their applications into.
It's the default, right?
Right. So if it goes away and you're not architected to deal with that, then there's a lot of people that are impacted. And I think this also touches on Mark's point as well, as far as the difference today with three big vendors. When you had three big vendors that were selling software, whether it be a database or whatever, outages were at individual points.
Mm-hmm.
With the cloud providers, they're the underpinnings for a lot of companies and organizations. And if they have an outage, it's not just a fixed point, it is hundreds of businesses that are suddenly down.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, and a lot of discussions that we've had just today and on other days around this, is so many people jump into the cloud thinking that automatically gives me high availability, that automatically gives me resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, no, nothing comes for free. No technology negates the need for good design and planning. And if you want to have that high availability, which is multi-availability zones so that you have that resiliency, your application actually has to be architected to deal with that. And that's hard.
Yep. Yep.
So is the issue, Ed, that and this kind of goes to one of the comments that I made, is the issue then that we're not thinking about cloud? Well, let me turn it a different way. My belief is we're not thinking about cloud in the appropriate way. When we think about traditional data centers, and we've all been responsible for this, when you think about a traditional data center, the resiliency is in the infrastructure, right? And I've talked about this for a very long time. But when you move to cloud, the infrastructure isn't inherently in the infrastructure. And what I mean by that is you have redundancy in drives, you have redundancy in power supplies, you have redundancy in buses, right? But when you move to cloud, you have to be able to move that redundancy up the stack, meaning the application has to be more infrastructure aware than it ever has been, and not rely on resilient infrastructure to properly operate. And I think that is the rub, is that in a nutshell, we haven't made that transition yet.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, and sorry, I didn't cut off anybody, did I?
Nope.
I would agree with that assessment. I mean, all of us have been having many of these conversations for a long time, and we've had, this specific conversation about resiliency in the app layer off and on between the three of us and others for 10 years now, probably, maybe longer. And there are a couple of things that I would posit associated with that. And one is that, yes, enterprises need to be more responsible in making a determination about what the actual cost of being in the cloud is, not what the cost of being in the cloud is when I do it the cheapest possible way, but what is the cost of being in the cloud when I do it the way I need to do it in order to protect my business the way I would have expected my IT team to protect my business before. Yeah. And we shared a lot of tweets about that on Twitter. And part of the reason that we all understand is that network charges between zones can be really, really expensive. So in and out traffic, that's where some of the cloud providers make a ton of their money. Setting up or actually building applications that support distribution across regions and can disappear in any one region without affecting a given set of customers are still a little bit of magic. I mean, how many of us still reference Netflix on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. I can tell you right now that of all the applications I've ever been a part of designing, and I'm not a coder, so I'm not designing it from the code level, but designing certainly to support it from an architectural standpoint and from an infrastructure standpoint, I can tell you in breadth of complexity, the Netflix problem in its original design was actually really simple. And yet it was really hard. It took them years to perfect how they used Cassandra distributed across multi-regions to perfect what they've got available today. Imagine trying to do that for even 2 or 3 of the traditional complex IT apps in an enterprise, let alone the whole breadth of applications that make an enterprise fully available. Right.
Well,
so
that's making an assumption too, right? Sorry to Ed.
No,
that's
go ahead.
making an assumption that those enterprise applications, you have the expertise to be able to understand and characterize that, and 2, the access to be able to tap into it. Remember,
Absolutely.
not all of these applications are custom built. They might
Nope.
be commercial off-the-shelf packages that we drop down,
point.
right?
Yep.
Right.
Excellent point. Yep.
And it comes back to, you know, what are your requirements? You know, what is your business continuity plan? What are your recovery times? You know, your data recovery times and your process recovery times that you need to be able to have. That when people started jumping into a cloud, a lot of those questions didn't seem to get asked anymore. It was just assumed that if I'm in the cloud, that all happens.
Right.
And it doesn't, like we're saying, it actually has to be designed and planned for and tested to see, did that design do it? You know, you don't wait until the outage happens to find out that, oh crap, the design didn't work.
Right.
Right.
Well, and that's
I mean, Netflix, I mean, they're the ultimate chaos monkey from a testing perspective.
right.
Of they go and they build something and they go and they pull plugs out to make sure that my failovers are going to work, that I'm still going to have my business continuity, because the last thing I want is my subscribers to suddenly not be able to get a video.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and another part of that problem. Sorry, Tim, if I jumped in on you. Another part of the problem, to your point, Ed, is that when you own all of everything involved, with the exception of maybe the network service provider that connects 2 of your facilities, you can test literally everything.
Yep.
You can't come close to testing everything in a cloud environment, because
Right.
the truth is nobody would have tested for the problem that we recently experienced with Amazon that lasted. No one could have tested for that.
Right.
So guys, I apologize. I have to exit for just a second. Hopefully I'll be right back. Sorry.
But I think this is one of the questions that comes up is, why aren't we making that connection and bringing this back to our original premise of, are we putting too many eggs in each cloud provider's basket and potentially then doing it in an incorrect way? Are we putting essentially spoiled eggs in each basket? What does that get us? What's the risk, both individually to an enterprise?
We're seeing the risk from that perspective, and I mean, AWS gets beat up because they are the most visible when they have an outage. I mean, reality is reality. They are the 1,600-pound gorilla in the room with the other 800-pound gorillas.
It's a big room.
and quite honestly, all 3 of them have really become too big to fail. We as a country can't afford for AWS to go away entirely for any period of time.
Yeah.
And the complexities of architecting something to work across availability zones go up exponentially if you want to try and make it work across cloud providers.
Right.
I mean, I've had a lot of people that tell me, well, we're going to multi-cloud so that we don't get lock-in and we have resiliency and high availability. And it's like, no, you don't.
Yeah. I mean, I think lock-in's a red herring. I've written about this, quite a bit. I think the concern I have, and to Mark's original point that he made on Twitter, is, if you think about how many companies are writing on any given, let's just take the top 3 for conversation's sake: Amazon, Microsoft, Google. Amazon, Microsoft, Google. If any one of those had a systemic failure, not just an AZ, but a systemic failure, and some of the comments on Twitter, I think we're spot on to bring up, it wasn't just the AZ failure, but it also impacted some of the control plane activities, which affect all AZs. And so if you have a catastrophic failure, which I'll define as affecting multiple regions or the entire system, the entire core service, that has a huge potential impact, not just to an individual enterprise, but potentially to entire industries, and think of the economic impact too.
I mean, and to Mark's point, he mentioned at the beginning also, you can't get into your house now unless you have connectivity to the cloud. Of people, businesses, and consumers don't fundamentally appreciate or understand how dependent their everyday lives are on that capability now.
Yeah.
And when you get things like this, there's a sudden wake up. I mean, when the last AWS outage happened, and I saw the list of applications out there that had been impacted, it was like, my Lord, this is touching just about anybody in any industry.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the premise of Mark's original point is, we're not just talking about this impacting oil and gas or financial services or retail. I mean, this is something that could have economic impact to a given industry as well as given countries that their core services may be built upon it, right?
Right. I mean, to one of Mark's original points when he started the conversation, because a large portion of the financial service industry builds in AWS.
Mm-hmm.
So if, like you say, AWS had a huge systemic failure, you'd be taking down a large portion of the financial industry worldwide for a period of time. And that period of time doesn't have to be long to have economic impact. I remember one of the times when one of the AWS outages actually caused Amazon.com to have an outage.
Yeah.
And every hour they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars in business while they were down.
So let's kind of take this conversation in a different direction a little bit, because I think that the economic impact, I don't think we're necessarily thinking about that. But the other piece that I worry about is kind of this impending clash between the FTC and big tech. And so if you see this train wreck coming, I mean, what we're talking about is an uninformed body. And we've seen that just in the congressional hearings, right? Yeah. They're asking questions that make absolutely no sense to those of us that understand technology and strategy around technology. If you get folks that don't necessarily understand the implications of breaking up one of these companies, that could be disastrous. And then put that in the context of all of the eggs in one basket, we could have catastrophic issues, economic issues, if I'm understanding that right.
Oh, absolutely. And like you say, coming in with a sledgehammer to just smash things without knowing what you're breaking in the process, which is a good potential possibility with FTC coming in saying we want to break up this monopoly, for lack of a better word, in there, and so we're going to break them up into small little pieces, and it's going to have just huge impacts on people's capabilities, functionality, and their costs, because there's no way cost doesn't go up when they have to start breaking it up into smaller pieces, and people have to start integrating across those smaller pieces. There are as much as there are risks to having all your eggs in one basket, there are also benefits to having all your eggs in one basket.
That's right. And you and I have had this conversation around lock-in the past, and I think it's a great example of, everyone gets kind of wrapped around the axle. And I guess I should comment, Mark had to step away from our discussion. So if he's able to rejoin, I'll pull him back in. But if you think about lock-in, everyone gets wrapped around the axle that it's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a bad thing. There are good things, and we actively choose to step into those communities. I mean, one person calls it lock-in, another could call it a community, right? An ecosystem of different products and services that's unique and has intrinsic value in that specific community.
Well, but, one of my favorite phrases when we chat in the Twitterverse is everything's a trade-off.
Yes,
everything has benefits, everything has risks, and it's a matter of, from your business's perspective, what trade-offs are you willing to accept, and what risks are you willing to accept to be able to move forward? And one of those, lock-in, falls into that category. And a simple example I always used to use to people was SQL. SQL was supposed to make all databases equal because there was a common programming language against all databases, except
Mhm.
all database vendors started adding their own special pieces to help things run faster. And if you use those special pieces, you might be using SQL, but you are locked into that vendor because
That's
you're
right.
using their special pieces.
That's right. So let's take that and let's move that back to the premise, right? Of should we be thinking about maybe there isn't as much value as we think, or if we look at that value risk equation, maybe there's something to be said about not just the top three, but maybe we start thinking about 4, 5, and 6. So maybe it's a matter of, okay, I'm not just focused on Amazon, Google, Microsoft, but maybe I use one of those as my core, but then as my backup or my secondary, I'm looking at 4, 5, 6, or something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the other challenge you have, and I've had these conversations back in my consulting days, and I have these conversations where I'm at today, of that there are advantages to having the primary vendor. You get better deals. You know, if you're doing more volume in one particular vendor, you're going to get better pricing from them than if you're not.
Yeah, there is purchase power,
Right.
right?
There's purchase power. There's also a skill set challenge that
Yes, there
the
is.
more platforms that you're running on, the more skill sets you have to have in-house to be able to deal with those platforms.
Which one could argue would be more risk for the organization because you have to manage across those different platforms and the complexity that comes with it.
Right. I mean, my own personal perspective is I don't know anybody that is solely tied to a single cloud vendor.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's always going to be multi-cloud, but what I do see is somebody has their primary one that they do a majority of their work on, but
correct.
there are those trade-offs again of sometimes one of the other platforms makes more sense, whether it's because of particular SaaS capability or whether it's because it's a particular service capability that one offers that's significantly better than the other and is worth the risk of not being the primary platform and putting things on it.
Yeah,
Then
I
the
see.
challenges come up to the level of how do I manage and coordinate all of that, which is a whole other discussion.
Correct. Yeah, and I see the same thing. The other component that I'm seeing as well, and I'm sure you are, is it's not just how do I start to leverage each of the core cloud providers for a specific use. You know, I use Google for this, I use Microsoft for this, I use Amazon for this, and quite frankly, I see all three of those being used pretty regularly by any given enterprise. The thing that I am seeing as well is not just going to 4, 5, and 6, but also looking at on-prem. So it's not just building for cloud,
Right,
necessarily public cloud, but maybe I'm bringing that also on-prem, and that's my fallback because
right,
I might have a little more control, a little more management around it, whether I'm building traditional stacks, you know, server storage network and Kubernetes on top of it
right.
and different cloud services. Or, and I'm not talking about something like Outposts or Anthos. I'm talking about
Right.
just a more traditional stack.
Well,
Or
well,
I'm,
I mean, I've seen the evolution. You know, we had the days of cloud first, cloud only, and then cloud smart. When I have conversations with folks now, I take it to a different perspective. I say platform smart.
hmm,
Figure out what the right platform to put it on, whether it's an in-house data center, whether it's a private cloud in-house, whether it's a public cloud somewhere else. Back to those trade-off things. What
yeah,
is it you want to accomplish? What are the benefits and risks of your choices? And which one do I want to take? But look
yeah.
at it from that perspective and say, instead of saying any one place first, figure out what it is I needed to do, and then figure out, okay, how do my requirements match in each of these platforms, and which is the right one for me to move to.
So I think you just jumped ahead to the question I was going to use as we kind of wrap here on the half hour, which is what are some things that we should be thinking about? And I think that platform first, thinking about the appropriate platform is definitely one. You know, one of the other things that I mentioned in Twitter, and I'll just expound upon a little bit, is I do think we need to be thinking very differently about how we architect applications moving that resiliency, and I feel like a broken record with this, but we have to move that up the stack, literally up the OSI model stack. We have to move it from the infrastructure and move it closer into the application, not just at the platform, but in the application. It's kind of like, years ago, I used the analogy of Google. If you go to google.com, which data center are you working off of? And if they have a data center failure, do you necessarily know that for google.com, right? You don't necessarily know. Why is that the case? And so if you start answering that why question, I think you start to see where the gap may exist within your thinking around enterprise architecture and application architecture across the enterprise.
Right. And I think while we're having this conversation, one of the things hit my mind, and you've been around long time like I have, so you'll remember. I think one of the things that I find missing a lot nowadays are NFRs, non-functional requirements. I don't hear people bring them up anymore. You used to have those, which were what is my availability going to be? What is my resilience going to be? What is my recovery time going to be? What is my disaster recovery plan for it? That have nothing to do with the business requirements of the application, but have to do with making sure the application is running the way I want it to run, so that you have that transparency you just described with google.com of we don't know and we don't care and we shouldn't care.
Yeah.
It's the classic model of the light switch. When I throw a light switch on my wall in the house, I expect the lights to come on.
Yeah.
I don't care what power plant my electricity is coming from, nor should I care. I just expect that it's going to be there.
Right. But this is again where it's a change in thinking. It's a change in thinking. And so, as we kind of wrap here at the bottom of the hour, the one thing that I will say is, I think, especially in the last 2 years, while we've accelerated cloud development, meaning application development and leveraging cloud, I think on the other side, the fact that we've had challenges around staffing and retention has exacerbated this problem that we're talking about for the last 30 minutes, which is we're starting to make, in some cases, poor decisions. I mean, I've seen a number of companies, and I know you have seen a number of companies, they move to cloud based on the assumptions or marketing that they've read, and they don't get it. They don't see it. Expensive bills that they weren't expecting, failure that they weren't expecting. It's a completely different experience. And they weren't expecting that. They thought lift and shift. They thought that cloud is cheap, cloud is free. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. But I think that this staffing issue and the changes that we've seen just in the last 2 years have exacerbated the problem. And we have to get away from that. We have to backtrack.
Absolutely. And I do see that as one of the bigger challenges. It's the skill set and the culture set of being able to think about it from that perspective, get that more holistic picture of what it is that I'm looking at, instead of just focusing on that narrow, I just did this piece of functionality and I'm going to worry about that and nothing else.
Absolutely. Well, let's leave it there. Ed, great to see you. And I'm sorry our friend Mark Teely had to
especially since he's the one that started this.
I know, but he sent me a text and apologized profusely. Duty calls. So we'll pick up the conversation. If you have comments or thoughts on this, please hit us up on Twitter, LinkedIn. We'd love to continue the conversation. And with that, we'll end the broadcast.
Have a good weekend, sir.